Hello, this is Tiffany, your resident malt maven at Settlers Hospitality, bringing you another beer tasting at home in our series. So instead of our normal, here's a six-pack and here's the lineup, today we wanted to talk about what makes certain beers what they are. So today, because it's such a wildly popular style, we're going to talk about IPAs. So we have a variety of IPAs here, even within our cooler at Settlers Inn. So I'm going to talk to you about the history of IPA. So IPA, it actually stands for India Pale Ale, and that's because the style emerged when the British were occupying India for the first time back in the 1600s. So the East India Company, Britain really wanted to get in on the spice trade, and so they formed this company. They weren't really able to get into the spice trade, so they went for textiles because they could get these beautiful creations that they were available nowhere else in the world and bring them back to Europe. So they stationed some traders down in India, but what they found out was that if they had English ports in port, the prices seemed to go up on the textiles. So what they did was they stationed people down there permanently. So these guys were down there waiting for the best prices on textiles, and they kind of just had to wait until the ships were out of port. So what do you do when you're waiting around and you can't really go anywhere? My goodness, that sounds familiar. I'd say you drink some beer or any sort of alcohol, which is exactly what these guys did. So as the occupation went on for longer, and as people were coming to the area in a higher frequency, including not just these traders, but also like soldiers and people that had less financial means, people needed alcohol. They were thirsty, truly, and they did import some wines like Madeira and some beers, but for the most part, those came with a pretty hefty price tag because they were in small supply. So people turned to actually a locally indigenous to that area spirit, which is called Arak. And this was with terrible consequences because Arak is a very high alcohol content spirit that originated there. And I mean, people started dying because of alcohol poisoning, like in droves. So that wasn't a real sustainable option. I'd love to say that these soldiers and traders went with this because they wanted to shop local and support their local community, but that's not the case. This was cheap and it got the job done. But they started dying. So they needed something a little bit more sustainable to get there and sustain them in the British occupied India. So what came of this? All right, so in England, they wanted to figure out Britain, how do we get these beers that we love? Like porter was really big, and their pale ales, which kind of ranged. There really wasn't regulation back then as much as we have today. So things were different. And, you kind of called a pale ale. A lot of beers could be considered a pale ale or an IPA, which they weren't calling it that at that time. But what they did know from brewing, the things that can make beer sustain a journey, or anything really, having a higher alcohol content, which means adding more malt during the fermentation process to boost that alcohol, but also adding hops. They're a natural preservative, and they're really one of the things that gives this style, IPA, its characteristic quality, or signature quality, which is having that intense bitterness and having a lot of flavor. Depending on which hops you use, that changes. But so the brewers in Britain added these extra things, and the voyage that the ships took, that actually allowed the beer enough time to mature and be ready to drink. So that brought the costs down. The beer was widely available in India, and a new style was born because that continued contact with the hops really gave the beer a different quality, much like when you make tea. If you steep the tea bag for a long period of time, you're going to get a much fuller, even bitter flavor, which is kind of what happened with the beer. So anyway, that's the long and short of it, where IPA began. And, IPA was popular during that time in India. Then it kind of fell off. People got more into lagers, which were much more approachable. And with advances in refrigeration, IPAs really fell off the map because people are like, why am I drinking this? I want something quaffable, something that I can drink a lot of and it's refreshing. So lagers became popular. But as you know, now, like from like mid 90s until now, IPA has really just like had this renaissance, and it's pretty exciting. I mean, I think it's exciting, so of course it is. But IPAs have so many different characteristics. Like you might talk to people and they're like, oh, this one's really crushable, or like this is juicy, it's fruity, super haze bomb, you know, like all these terms. Like, what does that mean? So I have an array of styles here. I'm sad to report we don't have a New England IPA in cans right now. It's in a keg ready to tap, but it's not on tap right now. So once we get back to normal, I'll be drinking a lot of Hazy Bones, which is from Flying Fish. But Yards from Philly, this is the first one we want to talk about. This is more of an English style pale IPA, but with American finesse, I suppose. So what you're seeing here is Yards, their IPA has a nice like malt backbone, but you're also getting, you know, some earthy flavors, some citrus flavors from the hops. Then we took a departure from your standard like IPA firstborn here to the West Coast style Lagunitas IPA, founded by Tony McGee. This is a great IPA. It's been, you know, just renowned as like such a quintessential IPA from the West Coast. And it uses like 43 different types of hops. You're getting pine, you're getting citrus, you're getting resin, but that's a West Coast style. Then you're gonna get into a couple different variations. So initially IPA, it was like a higher alcohol content, which was indicative of that style. This is an Imperial IPA. Dogfish had 90 minute. So this one has a bit higher alcohol content, which is why they call it Imperial. But it also has a lot of malt backbone because again, like as you add more malt and the yeast consumes those sugars, it creates alcohol and CO2. So anytime you're gonna have Imperial, you're gonna have a bit more of that malt characteristic to it as well as the hop bitterness. Then by malt characteristic, I mean like it kind of has like a slight sweetness, or maybe you get some caramel notes, some earthiness. It just depends on the hops that are used too. Then we got into this, you know, people cannot drink Imperial IPA all the time. It has terrible consequences, almost as bad as when people were drinking Iraq to huge volume. You know, it's just too much. Like you can't drink a 6-pack of that by yourself and feel good. So Founders, then, you know, this is really the best known one on the market. It's a sessionable IPA. So they call it all day. You could drink it all day. Great. You have all day. So this one, it's lower alcohol content, 4.5% about. It's really easy, really crushable. People love that term to describe beer. You know, you can really just crush it. So that's really what Founders is all about with the all-day IPA. And then people started getting crazy and adding different things to their beer. So this is Coffee John from Neshaminy Creek. Now technically they call this a pale ale, juicy pale ale with nugget, which is Jawn, John. They're close to Philadelphia, so John is also a term where people are like, that John over there. They use it as like saying thing, you know, so this is a Coffee John. So they actually add coffee to something that's an IPA. So you've got bitterness from the hops, you've got bitterness from the coffee, just a lot of flavors going on. I mean, there are some crazy things people do with IPA. And I don't have a bottle here, but like these New England style IPAs, which are all the rage right now, they are typically really hazy, really juicy. They kind of look like orange juice with like a lot of, you know, haze in there. And they achieve that by adding like oats. They achieve that by adding a yeast slurry. They achieve that by adding juice. Like you could add anything to IPA and make it something amazing. You could make it less than amazing too. It just depends on the quality of the brewing that's happening. So this is, you know, kind of the spectrum of IPA here. We've got a lot of different options, you know, and there are tons of other IPA options out there. Not necessarily all that are featured here are all that's representative. You know, Victory's got some great stuff. Locally, Here and Now Brewing, they're open and they have a fantastic New England IPA that they're available now. They can do growlers, but during this time, you know, I'm a firm believer, drink what you like, and you know, you can find these here with us, or you can find them at your, you know, local grocery store or local brewery if they're still open. So, IPAs, that's the story. You know, just a little tidbit, something to mull over while you're sitting at home. But, you know, we're just trying to keep it exciting and keep the information flowing and the beers flowing. So, until next time, cheers from afar.